Hello, it's Eric Westgard, Amateur Call NY90, and I'm the president of the Minnesota VOAD Radio Club, Minnesota's Volunteers Active in Disasters, and also the Assistant Section Emergency Coordinator for Minnesota ARES for events in the Minnesota section. So the subject today is disaster recovery, or the general topic is. And the last couple of years, Amateur Radio Minnesota, we've historically been doing formal written message traffic and supporting marathons and supporting county and city emergency operations centers with message traffic, et cetera. But Rick Leiden, who is president of Minnesota VOAD, also on the National VOAD board, got us involved in the whole subject, which is pretty new to us, of disaster recovery and long-term recovery. And we discovered a couple things going to the meetings and attending some disasters. Emergency managers need more than just formal written message traffic. So things like real-time intelligence, ground truth reporting, a higher level of live situational awareness. We get a lot of requests from elected leaders and FEMA. We started joining the coordination calls, which are run. Jeannie, I think, probably had this call from the state. Salvation Army's there, Red Cross is there, Team Rubicon is there, all the different groups. I think up here we have more than 70 different volunteer groups. And again, most work is done by volunteers, but occasionally there's people on the call from FEMA and other agencies, and they're wanting to know how can they help, where can they help, where is the point of greatest need, asking questions like, is everyone safe? Who's at what locations? Where are more resources needed? What barriers and roadblocks? A pretty good example that we saw in our work with disaster recovery, and this actually came up at the Minnesota VOAD conference last year, was there's a system called crisis cleanup where you open up tickets. Residents can say, hey, look, I've got a foot of muck in my basement, my roof's leaking, and I've got a tree blocking my driveway. This is private property, so the city can't send a city crew out to do it, so we have to coordinate volunteers. So they open a ticket, but then maybe it takes a week, maybe it takes 10 days to get all the volunteers in and the crews established and set up in the area. Maybe they had their neighbor help them remove the tree. Maybe somebody helped them with the roof tarp, so the ticket might be stale. Or, we've got a situation where a volunteer group of 3 people comes in, they grab 50 tickets. Of course, they can't work all those tickets. And then a group like Samaritan's Purse drives up with a semi-trailer and 30 volunteers. They come into town and there's no tickets left. So there are issues with, self-deployment of volunteers. There's issues with coordination, of, fairness. So the area, I think, is not completely settled or fixed, and we saw some opportunities to get involved. So the program we're talking about today got its start in July of 2022 in Cottage Grove, Minnesota. We were invited to a flood recovery functional exercise. Dr. Gwen Martin, who's the city emergency manager, had not had any experience with ham radio operators, but Rick talked to her and got, in fact, on the left side of the picture is the chapter or area leader for the Salvation Army. On the right was an individual, a senior leader with the Red Cross, talking about an area of her city that literally is on the Mississippi River and literally floods almost every year, and talking about, what do you do if you get a couple of weeks of floods and affecting private property? So we had an emergency operations center, a shelter, a volunteer reception center, and public works. They were in the scope of our exercise. And really, the flood was impacting the residents. It was impacting access to an island. It was blocking roads. And we got involved and put radio operators at the different locations. And every half hour, we sent in a report. We call it a CANP report, conditions, actions, needs, and a PAR check or personnel check. And those dropped on Dr. Martin's desk, who was the incident commander for the exercise. And she concluded this was valuable information. She knew every half hour what was happening at each of our work sites, how many volunteers were engaged, what work they were doing, what needs they had, and thought this would be good in the situation. Now, she happens to be one of the leaders of the Minnesota All Hazard Incident Management Team, and this idea essentially got legs and moved forward, and we've tried it out several more times, and it really worked well. So brief commercial, this was probably reviewed for everyone. It wasn't for the ham radio community, but National Volunteers Active in Disasters, really a national organization, has state chapters. And looking at their core values, specifically cooperation, communication, coordination, and collaboration, we felt that the idea of improved communication, certainly the role of amateur radio operators, were very good at moving paperwork, moving messages around, and ensuring that there's a steady flow of communication either across organizations or up through to incident command was a thing. We felt there was a natural partnership here, and Rick was pushing this pretty hard, and it seemed to make a lot of sense. So the idea of a field observer is not new. Like incident command, it came from the fire service. There is actually a position, field observer position, and they're out there providing incident status reports from a fire. And fires are interesting because they move around, and the weather and the different types of fuel. And so it's really important that incident command has a clear and essentially live understanding of conditions in the field so they can make better decisions. So we borrowed essentially the position task book and a lot of the terminology and a lot of the processes that they use. And again, this reports in to the planning section. This is different than what we normally do as amateurs. So this was again not something that was brand new, and we heavily borrowed from it. So historically and today, looking at amateur radio operators, we're normally working for the communications unit leader, the COML. We're in the EOC. We're doing internal communications, certainly looking at recent FEMA doctrine. We're the C and E in PACE, right? The contingency and emergency communications, et cetera. So we've got a clear role over in the logistics section. And in something like a marathon or the MS 150 race, which is coming up here in a couple of weeks, we're essentially a resource team or a strike team. We're out in the field, and we're actually sending out supplies, athletes, and gear vans. We're picking up injured bikers. We're trying to be very focused on the event participants and sometimes the general public. In this particular case, we're providing information from the field observers into the situation unit. Again, this may or may not be spun up depending on the level of the incident, but essentially we're sending in reports on field conditions that then go up to leadership. And in the ham radio world, that would be what we call a net control, who really are coordinating the flow of information. Then they send that for decision-making purposes up to either the planning section chief or up to the incident commander, depending on how we're deployed. So the reporting method is, again, normal amateur radio procedure is a directed net. It's every 30 minutes or however you want. We can do it every 15 minutes. It's really dependent on the needs of the situation. We use a slight modification to an ICS-309 form, and we call it a CANP. And conditions, actions, and needs are very common in the fire service. There's also a thing called a personnel accountability check or a PAR check, which was added on, we believe, by us. We think this is a slight modification to existing procedures. But conditions, action, needs, again, are in the fire service. So it's what's happening in the field, water's rising, light wind and rain, what type of conditions are we seeing? The actions, in this case, at one of our events, the volunteers were sandbagging, we're protecting private property. Needs, again, there was a shortage of sandbags at one of our events. The people were mucking out a basement, which is very glamorous work. And it was actually Team Rubicon needed 50 feet of 1.5-inch suction hose, which we didn't happen to have in our stock and had to send somebody to the store to get. And then the PAR check was, in this case, we had 10 Team Rubicon volunteers on site, all accounted for. And I think, especially when you're doing things like chainsawing, I think there's a real concern: is everybody safe? Is there a report? And then, where are the resources, and are there excess resources, et cetera? So again, the format is, this is our suggested format, but this is not required. Again, and one of our folks from the state, not to name any names, Jeannie, says, no, I'd really rather have a sit rep. That's fine too. The idea is you get the information you need, in a format that you want it in, and we're not super fussy about what that is. So in closing, we've tried this out a bunch of times. This is the picture actually was taken in Waterville where we were called out for a flood. We had there were 350 crisis cleanup tickets open. It's been some really serious water from rising rivers and streams, and we were able to show up and practice a little bit of this coordination and what people needed and resource requests, and again our CANP reporting. We tried this out at the Minnesota State Communications exercise in 2025 up at Camp Ripley. Again, we deployed, there were 5 of us, and we just sent in our CANP reports to leadership, who happened to be Dr. Martin, and she was super happy because we don't report in through the operations chain. We don't report in through the logistics chain. She gets unfiltered direct information. So if someone says, what's going on right now at this site, she gets a direct report. It doesn't get filtered, and someone says, well, we don't want to tell the boss that the radio tower is stuck or the generator won't start. We can report that information through. And I think really field observers support decision making. Steve Hartman, who is our leader from the Red Cross, better data, better decisions. He keeps telling us that. And then you can test it tomorrow. It's super easy. I think the hams have figured out this is pretty much just a tweak on existing procedures. And again, if anyone has any questions, I'm open for that.